I'm Rick Ostrander, the Executive Director here at the Michigan Christian Studies Center. We exist to, as you can see from our mission here, to provide a place of community that helps connect Christian faith and academic life here at the U of M. We do that in a number of ways, provide a place for Christian community. We do Christian formation and courses for students. But one of the things we do is about every month or so, we do a public event on important issues facing society here. We tend to move toward contentious issues rather than away from them because we feel like that's where dialogue is most needed. We've done events on diversity here at U of M, contentious topic, politics, among other things. Tonight we're dealing with an important issue of immigration and refugee resettlement. So the title is Welcoming the Stranger in an Unwelcoming World, Immigrants, Refugees, and Religion in Modern America. Obviously, immigration has been at the forefront of some of the issues affecting our nation, often dividing Christians themselves. There, of course, is that American ideal that I learned as a child on the Statue of Liberty about give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to be free. We also know Christian compassion leads us to follow the Old Testament mandate to welcome the stranger. Others point out that nations without borders or standards for admission can undermine their own security and prosperity. So this is one of many issues that Americans hopefully discuss and debate or sometimes shout over in recent years. Tonight we're going to be looking at the human faces of these issues and also the role of religion in motivating and shaping the nature of work with immigrants and refugees here in the U.S. So I'm excited to have with us, first of all, Melissa Borja, who's an assistant professor of American Studies here at the University of Michigan. She focuses on religion, migration, ethnicity, and politics. Her most recent book is entitled Follow the New Way, American Refugee Resettlement Policy and Hmong Religious Change. It's been the winner of several awards in history and in church history. She also has a podcast that she will be sharing with you called 1 Million Neighbors. And then we also have speaking with us Sophia Ortiz, who did her undergraduate degree at the University of Puerto Rico and then her master's in social work here at the U of M. She serves as a program officer at Global Refuge, and she is compelled by her own Christian faith to work with refugee resettlement here in Southeast Michigan. So if you've been to events before, we follow a pretty familiar format. Each of these two will give some brief comments, and then I typically have some questions to start with. I'm the director, so I get to ask the first questions. That's my prerogative. And then we open up to audience Q&A after that. And we keep things moving, and we'll keep the air conditioning on, and we'll be done around 7:15 or so. Okay? So I'm going to ask Melissa to come and join us first, and we'll get the PowerPoint switched around, but let's welcome Dr. Borja.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Before I jump in, I want to ask, are there any undergrads in the audience? Raise your hand if so. Okay, I see a lot of hands. That's really exciting to me. For context, all of my work on the history of immigration and refugee resettlement and religious life began when I was an undergraduate. The world was kind of different then. It was about 25 years ago when I actually began work on the project that became my first book. I was a sophomore in college. 9/11 had just happened. And I was trying to grapple with what it means to live a good life, a meaningful life, what it means to connect scholarship with the needs of the world around me. I was very concerned about the degree to which my Muslim and Arab and South Asian friends and neighbors were the targets of horrific acts of violence and hate that affected me deeply and changed the trajectory of my work. I was also, at the time, very interested in George W. Bush's talk about and support for faith-based initiatives. One thing that I was very curious about at that time is that there was a very little discussion about how there's a very long history of government collaborating with religious institutions to do various forms of humanitarian work overseas and social service provision at home. And so this project began as a way of helping historicize that conversation in the early 2000s. So maybe if you are inspired by something that you're working on now, if you are giving a book talk 25 years from now, invite me, I'd love to know. This could be you in a quarter century. All right, so for context, I am a historian of immigration and religion. I direct the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program here at Michigan. We have one of the finest programs in this field in the country. I think we are actually better than UCLA. I was born and raised in Saginaw. Anyone from Saginaw here tonight? Okay, some of you might know it as Sag Nasty. I call it Sagan Awesome. Very proud to have grown up there, the child of immigrants from the Philippines. And so one thing that's important for me is to connect the story that we tell today to my own personal story, knowing that I am here because my parents, number one, grew up in a country that was a colony of the US. So many migrations that we see in the US today are the product of American empire and war making overseas. That's true for my parents. That's true for the people I'm going to talk about today, Southeast Asian refugees from Laos and Vietnam. One other thing that's important to me is to speak to communities of faith. I am very active in my own religious community. I actually think this is the space where I love to do my work the most. Because one thing that's really beautiful is to have the chance to have a conversation about a contentious political issue that's centered on values. And I can't think of a better space to have those conversations than in a church basement or a Sunday school classroom or in a Christian study center not far from campus. So I thank you here. Thank you for being here today. So this is my book. It came out 3 years ago. I worked a really long time on it. I'm a very slow person. So it took me a couple decades to get it out. I don't think my mom's read it, but other people have and recommend it. The book broadly is about how American Christians played a really big role on bringing refugees from Laos to the United States. I speak particularly about Hmong refugees. I talk about also how these policies changed Hmong religious life in very significant ways and created a context in which many Hmong refugees decided to adopt Christianity. So that is my book, and I'm really proud of it. So if you have a chance to read it, I invite you. But if you don't, may I recommend to you this other more digestible thing, which is this podcast that came out actually 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago. So some of you might know the podcaster Brad Onishi. He does the podcast Straight White American Jesus. He talks a lot about Christian nationalism. He's doing a whole series of amazing podcasts about American religious life, especially as it relates to Asian Americans. So my podcast is a limited series, so just 6 episodes. The first 3 dropped on April 2nd, and the last 3 dropped on Thursday. And in this podcast, I talk about a very basic thing, something that continues to surprise me. In the face of widespread hostility, 1 million Southeast Asian refugees came to the United States and were resettled in Minnesota, in Michigan, in California, all across the country. And it was made possible largely because of people of faith, especially Christians. People literally opened their homes, sometimes housed refugees in church Sunday school classrooms, and showed enormous amounts of generosity and courage, compassion, and they did so at a time, and I'll get into this a little bit later, at a time when people like now were really opposed to immigrants and refugees. And so I'm a hopeful person by nature. I am really compelled by stories of kindness, of love, of radical hospitality. And so my inclination is to hold on to those stories now more than ever, because I think we are in a moment when we aren't seeing as much love and generosity and neighborliness as we could. And I think we are seeing profound acts of neighborism, as it has been called, in places like Minnesota. So some of those people show up in this podcast. I also talk about how Southeast Asian refugees themselves, or the descendants of them, are showing hospitality and care to migrants today. So some of the characters you might encounter are like Bishop Marianne Buddy, who is very famous for her prayer service during Inauguration Week. I talk about pastors who are on the front lines of caring for refugees in Minnesota in the 1970s, but also what they're doing in the 2020s. Okay, so I'm going to focus on this very specific case of Hmong refugee resettlement. And for background, I could talk a lot about the history of American immigration policy and the role of religion in both the construction of American immigration policy and how Americans in general have responded to immigrants and refugees. I have taught whole classes on this. Happy to discuss that in the Q&A. But I want us to latch on to a very specific case study because I think sometimes it helps to have a very concrete example of what Christian compassion looks like. So let me begin first with actually human atrocity and violence. In the 1960s and 1970s, we saw terrible wars in Southeast Asia. It is the consequence of the global war on communism. It is the consequence also of years of imperialism and colonialism. You're familiar with this. I call attention to this because I think it's really important for us to remember that in the 1970s and 1980s, we see so many people fleeing for safety. It's not just Vietnam, it's also in Cambodia, it's also in Laos. This is part of this bigger story of war making in this region of the world. And this particular image is of a story cloth. Hmong people historically have told their stories through embroidery. So this is an example of a traditional pandao, which depicts the experiences of war and also flight, crossing the Mekong River, which you can see on the left, to safety. And you can see families traveling in long lines. The stories I've encountered through my oral history research and my archival research have been really, really stunning. I've had the chance to have long conversations with people who shared what it was like to have fought as allies of the United States during the secret war in Laos, and then to know that their future was uncertain if they stayed in Laos, that their lives were in danger, so they had to make the very difficult decision to flee their home, run through the jungle with their children, their family in tow, and hope that they could make it to safety. And so I want us to always keep that front and center. When we talk about refugees, we're talking about people who have experienced the work, multiple levels of trauma. The trauma of war, the trauma of forced migration, the trauma of having to make a new life in the United States. And I think when we talk about refugees and immigrants in America today, we forget that these are people who are survivors of so many painful moments. The sad truth is that not once in the history of American refugee resettlement and public opinion polling has there been a moment when a majority of Americans have supported refugee resettlement. So here's some figures from throughout US history. 1939, only a minority supported accepting Jewish refugees. 1975, in the wake of the fall of Saigon, still a minority of Americans supported bringing Vietnamese refugees into the US. And once again, 2016, Syrian refugees, again, only a minority of Americans supported resettling them in the US. And the reasons people give for opposing refugee resettlement in the particular moment I study are pretty familiar. So I'm going to give you just a rundown of some of the things people said in a New York Times article made in 1975 when a journalist went to a town called Niceville. I'm just going to say, not necessarily the nicest place, nicest thing, so there you go. And the journalist interviewed a bunch of people and asked, well, what do you think about these Vietnamese refugees who are arriving at this nearby Air Force base? And here's what they said. As far as I'm concerned, they can ship them all right back. We got enough of our own problems to take care of. They don't even have enough money to take care of Social Security now, and they want to bring in more people. I don't see why I have to work and pay taxes for those folks who wouldn't work over there. They ought to have stayed on over there. How do you know we're not getting the bad guys? You can't say for sure. Nobody can, and Lord knows we got enough communist infiltration now. There's no telling what kind of diseases they'll bring with them. I don't know, but there's bound to be some of those tropical germs floating around. So there's a lot to unpack here. I could do a whole lecture just on this one slide. But I think what's worth elevating is, number one, these are arguments that preceded 1975, and these are arguments that are still very much in operation today. Concerns about immigrants being a national security threat, an economic threat, a cultural threat, a religious threat, a disease threat, all of these things are things people are saying now. And they said it when people were coming to the US from China, and from Italy, and from Eastern Europe. So these were very old arguments that were resurfacing during a time, admittedly, of a lot of economic uncertainty, social strife. So this was the climate. And yet, we saw the United States accept 1 million Southeast Asian refugees between 1975 and the early 2010s. And historians have actually pointed out, like, it's kind of a miracle that this even happened. I can't say, like, I am shocked every time I think about it. So what actually made that happen? Well, I think Christians played a really big part. And Christians played a really big part in all stages of the process. So let's go back to Thailand, where a lot of Hmong refugees, and refugees also from Cambodia, were staying. Christians were critical to providing humanitarian aid in the Thai refugee camps. In Ban Mi Nai, one of the refugee camps that housed a lot of Hmong refugees, the organization World Vision provided basically all of the medical care there. And you see a lot of interest from Christian organizations saying, Thailand is a really important place for us to be the presence of Christ. I had the chance to read the diaries of a missionary physician, where she talked about the meaning of doing missions as a physician, caring for people who were maimed by war, caring for babies who were born into terrible circumstances that they didn't invite themselves, and how that was really a calling for her as a Christian woman. And a lot of refugees encountered Christianity for the first time in these refugee camps. Let's go now to the United States. After a refugee is accepted for resettlement in the United States, after a lot of waiting, a lot of vetting, a lot of government paperwork, they are finally accepted for resettlement in the United States. But who resettles them? Well, we have a very interesting system in the United States, and this is something that my colleague will talk about in a little bit. We have a public-private system. A lot of things happen in the US because of public-private collaborations. But the main thing I want you to know is most of those institutions that do the work of refugee resettlement in the US are religious institutions. So here's a snapshot of the organizations that resettled refugees in 1981, which is roughly the midpoint of the major wave of Southeast Asian refugee resettlement. The affiliated institutions are colored red. You can see the lion's share of institutions here are religious. And some of them are still familiar names, like World Relief or Church World Service. If you look at the span of the last 2 decades of the 20th century, you can see fairly consistently that religious organizations do the bulk of refugee resettlement work in the US. And there are a lot of reasons for this. They have moral commitment, they have expansive networks, they have lots of volunteers, they have energy, they have knowledge. A lot of these groups have been doing refugee resettlement since the Second World War. And they're also advocating very aggressively. They're going to Congress and the president saying, please let in refugees, because it is our duty to welcome the stranger. For a lot of Christian women I interviewed, they also vehemently opposed the Vietnam War. And for them to resettle refugees was a way to make right, to atone for what they saw as American sins overseas. They also saw the work of refugee resettlement as an act of peacemaking, of simply loving their neighbor. And it's often these volunteers who did the work of congregational sponsorship. So these are pamphlets from the 1970s, and you can see how people describe the work of congregational sponsorship as religious work. They called it a ministry. And they did this work because they believed that churches could be avenues of God's love to refugees. I especially like this last line on the bottom, on the right. Jesus, who himself was a refugee, said that by helping refugees, we are really helping him. And what I love about that slide, or this slide, is that Jesus was a refugee is on signs all the time now. So that's language that people are still using today. So I realized I didn't explain this one piece. Basically, the government has contracts with a lot of voluntary agencies, many of which are religiously affiliated, to resettle refugees. And then at the local level, these voluntary agencies work with local congregations to serve as sponsors for refugees. So this was really, really common in the 1970s and 1980s, but it still happens today. And my own congregation sponsored a refugee family from Afghanistan in 2022. Actually, the day I finished the final version of my book manuscript, they said, "Hey, Melissa, do you want to be in charge of that committee?" And I said, "I guess I have more free time now. So, okay, I will do that." So I have a lot of thoughts thinking about what that looked like in 2022 and what I know it looked like in the 1970s and 80s that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Okay, so I think I've overspoken. I want to be mindful of our time and want to give space for Sophia, who's going to talk about refugee resettlement in the current moment. But I really want to lean into a few main points here. The first is that the experiences that we're having right now of a lot of people opposing refugee resettlement and also immigration in general, this is not new. There has been a really complex relationship that our nation has had with immigration since the 18th century. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that what we're seeing now has a really long history. But what we can also learn is, learn from that history and maybe take some inspiration from people who, like the church ladies I interviewed and who appear in my podcast, inspiration from the really profound acts of generosity and care that they showed in the face of a lot of widespread opposition to their work. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We will get to some questions for Melissa, but before we do that, we will hear from Sophia Ortiz. It's all yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rick, for the invitation. I feel very honored to be here to speak alongside Melissa and to see a lot of you. I have to say that I'm nervous because that always helps me, and I want to share all of my thoughts and just my personal experience and be able to have an open and honest conversation with you all. Fun fact, when the Michigan Christian Study Center started, I served as a volunteer, as a hospitality coordinator, so I feel super excited to come back several years later. As I've been out in the community, just working in different ways and just learning and sharing it in this space. So to talk a little bit about kind of like my work, I'm from Puerto Rico and I moved to Michigan in 2021. I'm a social worker and I started working with unaccompanied minors as a case manager and was able to have a lot of experience directly with kids that had crossed the border on their own and were migrating to the United States for a variety of different reasons. After that, I transitioned to working more at a regional level in Southeast Michigan, leading social integration programs that essentially supported refugees and immigrants in Southeast Michigan, connecting them with the community, helping them understand how basically things work here in the US, how different laws apply to them, how to get resources, how to get connected with churches, with food pantries, learn English, get a job, get kids enrolled in school, and every other question that they had that maybe they had learned overseas, and then we came together and worked through those things. And after that work, I had the privilege to lead refugee resettlement programs in Southeast Michigan and opened Flint's first resettlement site in 2024, which was an amazing experience and unfortunately just has suffered a lot of changes since then, which I want to talk to you all a little bit more about. So that being my work, I want to talk a little bit, open our scope a little bit to understand the different ways in which migration happens, not only a refugee resettlement, but other pathways as well, that it's important for our consideration when we are thinking about the immigrant community, a little bit of more of my faith beliefs, why I feel compelled to engage in this work, and why I would invite you guys as well to do too, and kind of like the state of refugee resettlement and migration right now as we know it, and share with you a story that's very near and dear to me, and I hope not to cry, but I already did earlier today, so maybe I can, I'll spare you on that. So to speak about the variety of pathways for migration, there's a lot of nuances with this, but we're going to narrow it down to a couple different avenues just so we can facilitate a conversation. First is the U.S. Refugee Admission Programs, known as the U.S. RAP, with a lot of programs that Melissa was referring to. This is essentially, when I say refugee resettlement, I'm kind of like intertwining that language and referring to U.S. RAP. And essentially, these programs resettle refugees that have been displaced and are in host countries and essentially are being referred from the United Nations to other countries in the world. Refugees do not have the ability to say, oh, I want to go to Puerto Rico, that would be my choice. But, or to say, right, they essentially, because based of affiliation, they would be sent somewhere. So please hold on to US RAP, refugee resettlement. I want to link it to our conversation later on. We have people migrating. When they cross the border, they seek asylum or another humanitarian parole status, and that normally happens at a geographical location and a point of entry. So when someone essentially would come to the border and essentially face, an asylum officer and then seek asylum at that point. And we have people that have different visas and whatnot, and then they're here in the US. We have people that are in student visas, work visas, tourist visas, the visa lottery, which is a very interesting concept, and other avenues. And I really want to highlight that an individual's legal status is directly associated to their life stories, their nationality, their pathway, and the determination of USCIS. And I want to highlight that because as we approach this conversation, I think something that I want to make sure I share with you guys today is that the story and how the life of a migrant and a refugee plays out also depends on a lot of external factors that are not dependent on their decisions. And I think that's important for us to realize, and it's a combination of that and our own personal convictions, that we have an opportunity to come close to a population that has different experiences than ours, and not only recognize them for their value as individuals, but the incredible opportunity that we have to learn from people that have lived and gone through adversity and different challenging experiences, and that have a lot to teach us as well. So, speaking to what leads us to care, we can talk about a lot of reasons, but if we narrow it down to kind of like 3 main points, we can talk about how we're image bearers, 2, how Jesus teaches us to love our neighbor and welcome the foreigner, and 3rd, Jesus comes near to the brokenhearted, and therefore we have an opportunity to do that too. So in Genesis 1:27, it says, so God created man in his image, in the image of God he created him. Basically, this portion of scripture is saying that an individual's worth is rooted in their creator, and they hold and bear the image of God. Therefore, that's where their source of worth and dignity essentially comes from. So it isn't contingent on what family you were born into, in a country, in a side of a border, in what you've done or what you haven't done, or your decisions or not, but we recognize people's worth because of who created them. Second, Jesus teaches us to love our neighbor in Matthew 25:35 says, "For I was hungry and you gave me food, and I was thirsty and you gave me a drink, and I was a stranger and you welcomed me." And linking it back to Melissa's point, right? Like Jesus, as we serve other people, as we serve the foreigner, we're also serving Christ. So I really want to emphasize the welcome. It's not just a positioning of our own opinions, but it's an active, it's an action that drives us to include someone that is part of another community outside of our own into our lives. So that's something that requires effort and active involvement. And the one that just really comes near to my heart in this season of my life is that Jesus come near to the brokenhearted, and in Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." And I think that God, the creator of the heaven and earth, is the one that sees and sits most high, but comes to the lowest of low. And that should be an opportunity for us to say that we want to be a reflection of that love and meet people where they're at in the affliction and the struggle. And bringing a brief caveat, refugees and migrants are a population that is incredibly resilient. And I think that in my brief 8 years of experience working here in Michigan, I've only come to maybe realize that I have so much to learn, and from them and from the work and from other people that are engaged in this. So to talk a little bit about the current state of refugee resettlement and immigration, there's been a lot of executive orders that have changed the landscape of this work, but there are two particular executive orders that I want to highlight today. One is the executive order known as Remain in Mexico policy, and the second one was issued on January 27th. I remember that day so vividly. The Realigning the United States Refugee Admission Program. So remember, US RAP program. So one of the pathways that migrants and refugees come to the US through. So in the Remain in Mexico policy that was also issued around that time, essentially this executive order ended CBP One app, which was a platform that was developed under the Biden administration that allowed people to seek asylum or humanitarian parole at the border waiting on the side of Mexico. So linking back to those pathways, without this app, people no longer have that opportunity to request an appointment and meet someone face to face and seek asylum at that point. Also, the end of humanitarian parole for Cuban, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. So, as I mentioned before, when individuals crossed the border or went through this program and were essentially in the US, this executive order terminated that status. So, if people that were here in the US that were under the status of that humanitarian parole immediately lost it. So what does that mean? That people that are working, that have purchased homes, that their kids are in school, that they're engaged, no longer have the status that has allowed them to be in the communities that they're in. And the second executive order, Realigning the United States Refugee Admission Programs, it immediately paused all refugee travel to the US and the vetting process. So the process that Melissa was referring to, refugees that were in host countries waiting to be vetted by USCIS, thoroughly screened, no longer were able to come. And I remember sitting at my desk and all my travel notifications for the families that we were anticipated to come immediately canceled. So imagine and we welcomed families that their travel documents for kids, the pictures were of babies. And when you would welcome them at the airport, the kids are already teenagers. So that's how long it can take. Imagine you anticipating being able to build your life somewhere new, and all of a sudden, in just a second, those things change. So it's just really devastating, and I think it just invites us to think about, like, what would that even mean for us if we were in that situation? And then for us, on our side, essentially it halted all services for refugees that had arrived in the US and were receiving social support at that point in time. And I'll explain a little bit of what that looked like in a little bit. So I want to share a story with you guys that I absolutely love, to be able to depict a little bit what this looks like in people's lives. And I'm going to talk about the story of HD and Justin. Justin is here on the left, HD, we call him HD, his name is Hidayatullah, but HD, on the right. And Justin was a soldier in Afghanistan in 2007, and HD was his translator. And as I mentioned before, I had the opportunity to start Flint's first resettlement program, which was really exciting. And HD and his family were the first family that we welcomed. And Justin essentially knew of HD because they worked together in 2007. So when the US troops were essentially leaving Afghanistan and the Taliban was taking over, there was a lot of people that were in danger because of their affiliation to the US Army. So HD lived essentially in hiding for 3 years, and as they were trying to help Afghan nationals that were associated with the US at that point, Justin was able to contact some of the people that were still on the ground. He was informed that some of the translators that were working with them had been able to evacuate, not HD. So it was really a miracle that he was able to get in touch with him. HD told him that he was in hiding for almost 3 years, his family not being able to even provide like enough food for his family, and that's when Justin began to support in the paperwork. So HD is someone that would be resettled through US REP. So essentially he comes as a refugee with his family, and Justin served as support, what we call a US tie, that essentially collaborates in the resettlement process, because as Melissa mentioned, this is a private-public program that really leverages the help and support of the community. So Justin came with us to the airport when we picked up HD and his 6 kids. And this is, I'm gonna cry. This is Justin and his wife and his daughter, who's essentially the same age as HD's kids. And this is HD and his wife, and all their kiddos are in the back. This is them meeting again after 15 years. And after a really long time of just trying to get Justin checking in with HD over time, are you alive, essentially. This is us after we picked all their stuff and we're walking outside. I really like these pictures. These blue bags are bags that the International Organization for Migration provides individuals. Essentially, sometimes people are in host countries and they're told, okay, you've been cleared, you're leaving. And I've known of families that essentially were on a Friday, they told you're leaving on Tuesday. So after all that time of waiting, you leave everything, you pack everything and go. So even there's families that have been in the US for a really long time always remember IOM bags and whatnot. So we're packing up, we're gonna take them to the home that we've prepared for them. This is prior setting up the home for HD. It was a family of 8, so that was kind of like difficult to navigate in Flint, but you know, we're trying to build an egress in the basement for all of their kiddos, and we had church communities and other volunteers support us in that work. These are the kids after they've gotten home, and that's probably like at 1, 2 a.m. They're playing with some toys that we've got them, and whatnot. So this is the last picture. So to conclude, what I mostly want to share with you guys, I think that when we think about refugees and immigrants, there's a lot of things that come into play and come into the conversation. I think when there's structurally so many factors that influence a person's life that are not up to them, And I think that's where we can meet people where they're at and welcome them, recognizing the value that they have as individuals, where their worth and dignity comes from, and see them also in that space and convey and be able to convey that reflection of essentially where God has come to meet us in our affliction, and us be able to find that opportunity to do for others as well. So there's a lot of other stories that I wanted to share with you, and then I practiced and I was like, oh shoot, I don't have time. So I hope to share more in the Q&A, and I'll pass it on to Rick.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to clear out some space here. Don't need our technology anymore. All right, so yeah, if you two of you want to take some chairs here, and I have a couple of questions I want to begin with, and then we'll open up for audience questions as well. I guess the first one, and maybe this is just my own ignorance and I should be better informed, but can you just basically, both of you can answer this, or either of you, but distinguish between a refugee and an immigrant, and what are we talking about in terms of relative numbers of these two categories?
Right.
You want to start?
Yeah. Categories are really important. I often prefer to use the big word migrant, just because there are lots of different ways that people move through the world and cross borders. Sometimes it is going one direction, but people are often quite circular, like they go back and forth, so that's the most capacious term. I think the simplest definition is to say that immigrants are people who sort of migrate to the US crossing an international border. Refugees, a type of immigrant. What's distinguishable from them, or distinct about them, is their circumstances they are forced migrants. So it is no longer safe for them to be in their particular home. And there are particular pathways for them to come to the United States, which Sophia can describe in greater detail. It's useful to make a distinction also between a refugee and an asylum seeker. So an asylum seeker also faces persecution and unsafe circumstances that force them to leave, but a refugee is identified as such and labeled as such before they enter U.S. soil, and then an asylum seeker, once they are in the U.S., then they claim asylum and go through that process. That is my very quick and dirty answer. What would you
Yeah, I
add?
agree with you. I think I've thought about this a lot, and now as I explain this, I think in simple terms, every refugee is a migrant. Not every migrant is a refugee. Refugee is a legal status that, as Melissa was explaining, people that come through U.S. RAP programs are granted refugee status prior to arriving to the U.S. So once they arrive, they already have their Social Security coming in the mail. They have work permits and all the documentation. A person that is seeking asylum here would be, an asylum seeker, and then ultimately, once they receive that legal status, they would receive that refugee status. So I think, basically, to put in numbers a little bit, the number has changed a lot, and to also highlight the differences. The number of refugees that are admitted is a precedential determination. Last year, during the Biden administration, and that was incrementally throughout the years of his administration, was 125,000 refugees. This year, it's 7,500. So the difference is abysmal. And that is only the number of refugees that come through that pathway. There's so many other groups that migrate through other avenues.
And this is a point that I think is really, really important, because we gave these distinctions, but who counts as an immigrant and who counts as a refugee and who counts as an asylum seeker, highly political.
Right.
Okay, so if I go back to the period I was discussing earlier, the 70s, 80s, a lot of church people were really frustrated because Southeast Asian refugees who were fleeing Vietnam, where they had been allies of the US, they were able to be admitted to the US as refugees and got a lot of support. Meanwhile, people who were fleeing war in Central America were not identified as refugees. And they had a different pathway and a different experience. It was a lot harder for them. And so Christians during that time were saying, I feel some kind of way. I think this is kind of morally questionable that we're giving all these resources to one group and not to another. And it really does come down to this. Immigration policy, whether it's about who gets in as an immigrant or a refugee or an asylum seeker, it's all determined by both domestic politics and foreign policy. And that is an uncomfortable truth.
Last thought. I'm gonna have so much fun here with you. I think we can link this back to USCIS's determination, right? Like, ultimately, it comes down to these policies that are arbitrarily put in place and are determinant to people's lives, right? Like how you write up a court petition, the type of application that you submit, the time that you're requesting, the different status. There are statuses that don't have continuous pathways for citizenship, so you end up like coming to a dead end. So there's a lot of complication to this, and a lot of different factors that influence how the course of someone's life.
So you both kind of have dealt with this issue on the micro level, looking at a particular group among refugees, working with individuals like HD, where obviously Christian compassion and the desire to help is quite strong and quite compelling and necessary. There's also the macro level. America's a big country, but is there a limit to how many, we'll use migrants, how many migrants a country like the U.S. can bring in before it becomes irresponsible? And if so, what is that limit?
Yeah.
I'm not an ethicist, nor am I a demographer. But I do think the question of what is a responsible number of people to bring in really has to do with our own imagination of what is responsible, right? So,
I'm sorry, imagination of what?
Of what we consider to be responsible. And I think there are big questions about what is the impact of, say, a refugee population on a particular community in terms of jobs, in terms of the use of social services, the impact on schools. Lots of times, and I'm looking at this with a very long view. I'm a historian. I look at decades and centuries. The people who people didn't want end up doing a lot of good in those communities. Like if you think about Westminster in Southern California and Orange County, people didn't want those Vietnamese refugees there, but they have really turned it into this big tourist destination of sort of Asian American culture. And I think we see this over and over again. The people that Americans consider American today, the white immigrants that are preferred by a lot of policymakers today, they were also not welcome in the 19th century and early 20th century. I can go on and on about the history of immigration policy. So there's a really long way of saying, I don't know if that's the best question to ask, if I'm being candid. I think a lot of it has to do with sort of our own consideration of like what kind of country we want to be. And if we can learn from the past, we know that we have been quite successful at incorporating refugees and immigrants. And they have contributed a lot, and it's not been as much of a problem, I think, sometimes as people frame it to be.
Yeah. To speak on, yes, 100%. I definitely agree with all of that, and I think it's important to have that in the forefront of our minds as we're coordinating this work and developing these programs. When a resettlement program essentially is started, at least a lot of things have changed in the last year. But to speak on the process and how the program in Flint started, essentially the State Department requires that programs consult with a lot of community members and local constituents to be able to have conversations on what are the different resources and coordinated efforts that can best support the resettlement of individuals. So at that point in time, you meet with the governor, you meet with different employers, you meet with different commissions, and you have that conversation, and you propose that number also based on what you can do in your operations and how you can want to scale that as well. That is also a conversation that happens alongside a state's refugee coordinator, which the state refugee coordinator of Michigan is absolutely fantastic and has been incredibly supportive of this work and being able to maximize as much as we can the numbers of individuals that we can resettle and coordinate those resources so we can ensure that people are as best supported as we can. But I think definitely understanding, I think, and even to link it a little bit more to faith, belief, and whatnot, I think if we approach it as we don't have enough resources, we're approaching it maybe with a little bit of a scarcity mindset, when if we believe that the Lord is the one that provides for all of our needs, we can share what we have and trust that He will provide for us and for our neighbor that also is welcomed in our community. So I think approaching it in a lens of generosity and inclusion, recognizing everything that this population has to offer, it is something ultimately that just will benefit our communities. And I think throughout history we've seen what an incredible contribution they've had to so many different aspects of local neighborhoods and communities, and to lives of people like mine, just being able to learn from others and be able to broaden my understanding of the world and different people that are out there and have so much to contribute.
So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll try to get to you. I might try to prioritize students, sorry, but we'll open up to anyone, but also identify yourself and try to keep your question brief as well. I saw your hand first.
Yeah, Robin Foss, I was going to back onto your question, which is there a policy that dictates now how many immigrants or migrants are allowed per year? And how is that number determined today?
Yeah. So the question, is there, and we're recording, so I want to repeat the question. Mm-hmm. So is there a policy dictating an overall number, and if so, how is that number arrived at?
I mean, yes, there are a certain number of spots for refugees allocated. There are a certain number of visas allocated for countries, there's a limit. And these are chosen limits by our government. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say one thing. Mostly we've been talking about refugee resettlement because I think that's where most of our work lies and our heart lies also. Mm-hmm. But it's important to know that when we talk about immigration policy, and if we are concerned about the problem of unauthorized immigration, we need to keep in mind that the problem of unauthorized immigration is very much the product of positive law. In other words, when the United States imposes limits on immigration, we set up the problem of unauthorized immigration. By which I mean this. Before the 20th century, really beginning with Chinese exclusion in the late 19th century, we didn't have big limits on who could migrate to the United States. But then the federal government, we had it at the state level, but then the federal government began to make limitations on who could migrate to the US as immigrants. The first group targeted were Chinese immigrants. And then we see the construction of a bureaucratic apparatus of deportation, of exclusion, of inspection at borders, and it builds from there. So if you look at the countries that send the most immigrants to the US every year, and the countries that also have the most unauthorized immigrants in the US, one thing to note is that there are a few countries that send a ton of immigrants every year. And a lot of those countries have historical relationships with the US. So Mexico sends a lot of immigrants to the US in large part because the US has a long historical relationship with Mexico. a lot of the US used to be Mexico. So we can't forget that this is the product of like American policies. Similarly, there are a lot of Filipino immigrants, this is my family, who come to the United States. There are a lot of unauthorized Filipino immigrants. It takes a really long time to be able to migrate to the US legally. That's in large part because, again, the colonial relationship between the Philippines and the US, the relationship that sets up sort of desire to come to the US, connections to the US, and so on. So it's a very long-winded, kind of disorganized way of saying we have limitations on the number of migrants who are able to come to the United States. We have also desires to come to the United States that are very much historically produced. And we have this problem of unauthorized immigration because of the numbers, the hard numbers that the US has imposed, which has changed over time in really significant ways. But we can't keep in mind, again, that our laws really shape this problem of illegal immigration.
Yeah, and to speak into that a little bit more as well, for refugee would be that presidential determination. Also individuals, right, as a human rights, when they're claiming asylum, that number can be based on whatever also is happening in the world that then influences migration in different ways. To also speak on positive policies that also address this issue of high numbers or numbers in general of what we can name as unauthorized migration. I think to provide examples in recent executive orders, USCIS, that is the agency that people essentially submit asylum applications, there was an executive order that changed the way in which people could apply for asylum. And that changed last year, that then they charged for some fees, and then there was another ruling that essentially required individuals to apply paying through electronic payments. And electronic payments had to come from a US financial institution. To have a bank account in the US, you need to have a social security number. And someone that is seeking asylum does not have a social security number. So I think that's an example that comes to mind on how if we are not creating policies that are keeping people at the forefront of our mind, then we're creating other problems in other ways. Also, to provide other examples, there's particular statuses that individual can have and apply for, and then they just sit and wait. They don't get a work authorization. And I think if I ask anyone in this room, what would you do if you don't have food? You'll tell me that you're gonna mow a lawn, that you're gonna build something on the side, that you're gonna take care of some dogs, that you're gonna cook for someone. So then we create barriers for people to be able to work, and that happens a lot with there's a particular population of Cubans in the Flint area face this problem a lot of times, and then we approach this argument as like, oh, people just want to live off of benefits. No one can live off of benefits when you get $200 on food stamps. And if you can make just an arbitrary number, right, $1,000 a month, no one's going to change that for $200 in food stamps. So I think it just goes to like what policies are we creating and what are the ripple effects of that as well. And we're creating additional barriers based on perhaps not on a security measure, but more of on an anti-migrant rhetoric. So.
Okay, thank you. Let's go over to the side here. Matt? Sure.
Thanks. So I'm a pastor, campus minister, and so my question's a little bit theological, a little bit ecclesiological. I was looking at some data in preparation for this, and the numbers on white evangelical Christians, white evangelical Protestants in the U.S. are pretty stark on their views of immigrants and refugees. 60% of white evangelicals think undocumented immigrants should be kept in camps. 61% think they should not be afforded basic rights and protections. And I'm curious, in your journey of learning about Hmong, and there are lots of other examples, in your journey learning about the Hmong and South Asian immigrants, what role did you see for evangelicals in particular in that, and then has that shifted in the intervening 30, 40 years? Why are white evangelicals so resistant to immigration?
So just to summarize that real quick, so has there been a shift in white evangelical attitude toward immigration specifically? And if so, what do you see in the data? What might explain that shift?
So I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer this particular question. My colleague at Calvin College, Kristen Gomez-Dumais, might be the best person to answer this. I first met her maybe a decade ago, and she gave a talk specifically about white evangelical attitudes about migration and border security, really thinking about it through the lens of gender, and I have found that very compelling ever since. But I will say this, I wrote a whole paper about evangelicals and what they think about Southeast Asian refugees in the 1970s, and let me tell you, it was really cool to read all these documents where people were like, oh my gosh, evangelicals really should do things to help refugees, in part because of missionary purposes. Like, people really were excited about Thailand as a site of missionary work in the 1970s and 1980s. There was a lot of it. A lot of the humanitarian work I discussed earlier really was a form of missionary work. And so that was one aspect of it. But also, a lot of these groups like the Christian and Missionary Alliance, had been very active in Southeast Asia, and then felt a loyalty to the people they had converted to Christianity and helping them come to the United States. So the thing about missionary work is it brings you all around the world, and you develop relationships with people. And what do people care about? I think your story really shows that people will show up to people for people they love, whether it's an interpreter who helped carry out a military mission, or a family they got to know when they were doing a mission in Laos. So what I saw is that evangelicals were really invested in refugee resettlement work and caring for migrants generally when they connected it to their calling to love their neighbor and to share the gospel. I don't know what's going on about white evangelicals today. I do think it's very, very unfortunate that something like refugee resettlement, which historically has had really good bipartisan support, and really good support across the theological spectrum, has suddenly become a really polarizing issue. And lots of people opposed it before, but I don't think you saw in the 1970s and 1980s the same degree of political polarization on this issue that you see today. I will say, if you look at evangelicals, knowing that evangelicals are a diverse group, and I work a lot with Asian American evangelicals, that the numbers look pretty different for Asian American evangelicals, Latino evangelicals. It's really the white evangelicals, I think, who are a complicated group, and I do think political polarization is part of that story. What do you think?
Do you want to jump in on that at all? No.
Yeah, I'll share a brief comment, and I would love if we could get your question. I would love to think about this more. I think this is complex. I think what I can maybe speak on is that I would say minority communities and communities of color are quick to respond. I think because they have frameworks that allow them to see each other's pain. Mm-hmm. And I think that should just be a question for us as individuals. Why don't we are able to see others and do deep work to understand what perhaps assumptions or bias that we have towards other communities? I think that there's a lot of solidarity because perhaps of different structural issues that happen, and I think that's why we see a lot more solidarity and quick response from communities of color to be able to bridge those gaps and extend a warm welcome to individuals. So I think that's my brief comment, but I would love to talk about it more, and I think that it's a very important question that every church should be asking themselves. Why do you feel resistant to perhaps some populations over others?
I don't know if you had a question as well. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. This is fantastic. Yeah, this is sort of building upon Matt's question about both racialization and about difference. Like, one of the most striking slides that you had up, Melissa, was the sort of through line of like the attitudes about immigration surprisingly have remained fairly static, but we keep talking about how we're in exceptional or unprecedented times. So on one hand, there's race, right? The racialized disinclination to welcome a stranger. There is a reason that the parable of the Good Samaritan comes in response to the question, Lord, who is my neighbor, right? And there is a sense in which race plays into this. There's a romantic notion that Italians and Irish immigrants were once not racially like. There's a reason that they were able to sublimate into broader American society in a way that fourth generation Japanese Americans weren't when they were into, right? But similarly, we are seeing a difference. A lot of the religious work you said happens in refugee resettlement happens through not just religion in an abstract and spiritual sense, but through concrete institutions, right? And this is not unfamiliar to American history. The Black church during the Civil Rights Movement was the primary network for civil rights movement. However, the thing we are seeing right now is an increase in religious disaffiliation, and that largely reflects primarily in those institutions. There's a lot of people out there who still might identify with their religious tradition and not work in and through their religious institution. And if it is religious institutions that are primarily doing the work of religious resettlement, what does that mean for our present moment?
Yeah.
We both have a moment of highly racialized tension and a moment where people are less religious than they have ever been. What does that mean for the stranger?
I'm not going to try to summarize Nathan's question. He's a PhD student in history, by the way, so if you're wondering. But English, sorry. You should have been history, you went English, but no. Excellent. Yeah, excellent. I'm not going to, I'll let you unpack that question because it's a lot there.
This is really concerning. So if I can summarize it here, in this moment when we are seeing greater degrees of religious disaffiliation, if we are a country that historically has relied on religious people to do the work of resettling and welcoming migrants, refugees and migrants, what are we to do in this current moment? Is that a good summary here? Okay, so a couple things. I think it is interesting to note that as far as I know, the public opinion data suggests that secular Americans or religiously unaffiliated Americans are generally more supportive of immigrants and refugees, and so I'm not worried about them. But I am also intrigued by some of the conversation about how more people are going back to church. We are seeing a rise of religious affiliation again, or maybe a flattening out of that downward spiral or downward trend. I have long suspected, I don't know if this is true, that the conversation about more men going back to church is really just about more women being fed up with misogyny in churches and leaving. So that's my other thought about sort of religious trends. I will say that I think a lot of the values that Christians have shared in the broader discourse are shaping a lot of people, even if they're not going to church. So if you look at what happened in Minnesota in January, you saw like an amazing outpouring of care and support for people who were on the receiving end of really aggressive immigration enforcement. Some of those people might not go to church now, but they have been informed by religious values that infuse our culture that I think are so common that we consider them as American as apple pie. Like what it means to care for your neighbor is a value that has religious connections, but also has become part of how we imagine what it means to be a good American now. So I do think that that is part of it. I also think, and you can tell me, resettlement today is relying on different forms of institution, and so not relying so heavily on just the traditional congregation. And so they're being more expansive in how they're carrying out their work. I did congregation-based work, but you tell us, like you saw different institutions being involved, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. I really appreciate your question. I think it invites for a lot of discussion. If I'm understanding correctly, I think what you're asked, please correct me, is what does it mean for people and the work of welcome if people are leaving the faith and the institution was primarily the one carrying this work? I think a lot of people are moving away because they feel like these larger institutions are failing to respond to the work that we should be caring about. So I think that's an invitation that for individuals that are still part of the institution to question and push back and ask, why are we not partaking in that? I think that people also are moving to respond in different directions, and then they're affiliating in other forms, in other institutions that are then responding to this work. I would say that yes, there's a lot of churches that partake in this type of work. I would say that there's a lot of other groups of volunteers that have decided to build their own coalitions and respond to needs that they're not being met through other groups of people. So what is it means for them? I feel so much hope by these other coalitions that are forming, and for the churches that are still very involved. And I think rather than a question of despair for the people that are coming, I think it's a pivotal moment for people to ask those institutions, what are you doing? And invite in to respond and to be able to be that liaison. Obviously that requires a lot of emotional work to put yourself at the forefront and spear those initiatives. But I think it's an active invitation to invite others that might have been distant to those issues to come back and realize how important this work is.
Let me just ask one closing question, and hopefully you can stick around for some conversation as well. But you both have implied or suggested that it's something we should all care about or be involved in. What would you practically suggest to either a college student or a non-college student who's not a professional social worker or not a professional historian? If they care about this issue, what do you do?
A few things. Number one, don't lose hope. I think it can be a really hard time to do this work. I was saying at the beginning of our evening together, I teach 2 courses right now. One is the Immigrant Justice Lab, which is with the law school and with undergrads, and we do work with the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. And we help their attorneys prepare asylum briefs for unaccompanied minors. These are kids who are fleeing terrible situations. We're working on Afghanistan cases right now. It's terrible. It's really easy to feel hopeless, and I think we can't lose hope. I think a second thing to do is to continue to learn and encourage others to learn with you and to be a node of truth in your networks. So we know that there's a lot of nonsense on the internet, and we know that one of the best ways to address really harmful narratives that circulate, that dehumanize other human beings, that one way to disrupt that is to be a node of truth in your personal networks. So every opportunity you can to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of the people in our community is powerful. And the third thing is join a group. I also teach a course on internships, and I encourage people to not do this work alone. We have organizations for a reason. Get involved with a church group, a community organization that is serving immigrants and refugees. Get to know other people who care about this issue too. Do this work in deep relationship with other allies and with migrants, and that I think will carry you through.
Mm-hmm.
Sophia?
Some tips and tricks. I think one, being aware and pressing on to the things that make you uncomfortable. And it can be overwhelming to sit and listen to the news in the morning and the evening and try to digest everything. I think relevant work is not limited to your ability to encompass every single issue in the world. So that should not hold you from partaking in different ways that you can engage. I think that the biggest thing is awareness, asking the questions, and not furthering narratives that have not been fact-checked. I think you can learn as much as you can, participate from conversations. I really feel so privileged that so many of you showed up to have those conversations. Ask sit down with your pastor, sit down with someone that might have a different life experience than you, and ask the question that maybe you feel shy to ask, that you don't feel comfortable. Like, I think a welcoming question for someone is looking at them and maybe they look different from you and say, where's home for you? And that be an inviting conversation to learn of something that you don't. If you have the ability to partake in refugee resettlement work and in other spaces, Michigan is a fantastic state that is doing incredible work welcoming migrants into our communities. And right now, I think I could just offer up facilitating connections if you're interested in collaborating in different ways. But do not despair, learn as much as you can. Don't be please don't scroll endlessly. Fact check the information you're consuming. Invite others to conversation and lead with curiosity and care.
All right, let's thank our guests.